The younger brother betrayed his family's trust through an affair with his sister-in-law. She later abandoned him, taking his savings and departing with someone else. When he returned home in distress, his older brother's response was simple: just one phone call. One phone call changed everything. That's right. A single call brought justice after the ultimate betrayal. When Daniel had an affair with his brother's wife, he thought he'd found true love. Instead, he found himself alone, broken, and bankrupt. But sometimes, karma has a way of coming full circle. This is a story about two brothers, one who always did everything right, and one who threw it all away for a moment of passion. When Emily cleaned out Daniel's bank accounts and disappeared with another man, he came crawling back to the family he'd destroyed. He thought a simple sorry would fix everything. He was wrong. But what happened next will surprise you. The same brother he betrayed became his unexpected savior, facing down the woman who had torn their family apart. Through one powerful phone call, he helped Daniel get justice. But at what cost? Can some wounds ever truly heal? Stay with me as I take you through this gripping tale of betrayal, justice, and the true meaning of family. You'll witness how karma catches up in the most unexpected ways, and how sometimes the person you hurt the most becomes your strongest ally. If you want to see more real stories like this that will make you think twice about trust and family, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful message about karma and redemption. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this incredible, true story. Let's dive right in. The moment that changed everything wasn't a loud crash or a dramatic scene. It was a quiet revelation that began with my younger son, Daniel. Looking back now, I can see how each choice he made was like a small crack in our family's foundation until everything finally crumbled. Picture our family just a few years ago. The warm aroma of my wife's pot roast filling the house every Sunday, laughter echoing around our dining table, and photo albums full of summer vacations at the lake house. We thought we were blessed with two wonderful sons, each unique in their own way. Brian, our eldest, was like a sturdy oak tree, rooted, reliable, and growing stronger each year. He found his perfect match in Emily, his college sweetheart, and together, they built exactly the kind of life parents dream about for their children. Their home always smelled of fresh-baked cookies and baby powder, and the sound of their children's giggles was music to our ears. Brian took every lesson we tried to teach him and turned it into gold. He worked his way up at his company, never missed a family event, and was always the first to offer help when anyone needed it. He was the kind of son who still called his mother every Wednesday just to check in. Then there was Daniel, our shooting star. Where Brian was steady, Daniel was spectacular, but unpredictable. He could charm anyone with his quick wit and bright smile, and somehow always landed on his feet no matter what trouble he found himself in. While Brian was building his future brick by brick, Daniel was chasing the next exciting moment, leaving a trail of unfinished relationships and half-started dreams behind him. We worried about Daniel, of course, but we never imagined he could cause the kind of pain that would tear our family apart. When Sharon came into his life, it felt like finding the missing piece to a puzzle we'd been trying to solve for years. She had this gentle way about her, a calming presence that seemed to smooth Daniel's rough edges. She loved gardening and would bring us fresh vegetables from her backyard. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and always knew just what to say when things got tough. Their wedding was small but perfect, just close family and friends in Sharon's parents' backyard, with fairy lights strung through the trees and homemade cake that her grandmother had baked. For a while, it seemed like Daniel had finally found his anchor. Sharon brought out the best in him, and we dared to hope that this was his turning point. But like a tide slowly pulling away from the shore, Daniel began to drift. First, it was small things. Coming home late from work, missing dinner plans, spending weekends, finding himself. We watched Sharon's smile fade a little more each time she came to family gatherings alone, making excuses for his absence. She kept trying to be the perfect wife, but even the strongest foundations can crack under constant pressure. What we didn't know then was that the worst was yet to come. The truth crashed into our lives like a storm on a clear day. I'll never forget that rainy evening when Brian showed up at our doorstep, his shoulders slumped and his eyes red from crying. My wife took one look at him and knew something had shattered our eldest son's world. Over cups of coffee that grew cold and untouched, Brian shared how his perfect marriage had crumbled like a house of cards. Emily, his high school sweetheart and wife of 7 years, had been living a double life. The signs had been there, her phone always face down, mysterious work emergencies, weekend conferences that seemed to multiply. Brian, trusting to a fault, had brushed away his doubts until he couldn't anymore. A carelessly unlocked phone had revealed messages that confirmed his worst fears. The love of his life was in love with someone else. Meanwhile, across town, another marriage was unraveling thread by thread. Sharon, tired of living with Daniel's ghost, finally gathered her courage one night. She waited up for him, the kitchen clock ticking away the hours until he came home with another flimsy excuse ready on his lips. But this time was different. This time, Sharon refused to accept the well-rehearsed lies about late meetings and work stress. The truth spilled out like poison between them. Daniel, cornered by Sharon's quiet determination, finally confessed. But it wasn't just any affair. It was Emily. Our Emily. Brian's Emily. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking everyone within reach. Sharon later told us how the room had spun around her as the pieces clicked into place. All those unexplained absences, all those times Emily had canceled family dinners at the last minute. What made it worse was watching the ripple effect of destruction. Sharon wasn't just dealing with her husband's infidelity. She had to face the fact that someone she considered family had helped destroy 2 marriages. The betrayal ran deep, cutting through years of shared holidays, family photos, and trusted relationships. But perhaps the most shocking part was what happened next. When everything came to light, there was no remorse, no shame, just excuses wrapped in romantic rhetoric. Daniel and Emily sat in our living room, where we'd shared so many family moments, and tried to paint their betrayal as some kind of epic love story. Daniel, with that familiar charm that now felt so hollow, spoke about destiny and unavoidable connections. Emily, who'd once been like a daughter to us, claimed her marriage to Brian had been dying anyway, as if that justified setting it on fire. They spoke about their special bond and undeniable chemistry while Brian and Sharon sat there, their worlds in pieces. It was like watching actors in a terrible play, completely disconnected from the real pain they'd caused. Their attempts to romanticize their betrayal only made it more grotesque, like putting a bow on a weapon used to wound the people who loved them most. The contrast between their fairy tale version of events and the devastating reality they'd created was enough to make anyone sick. Here were 2 people who had not only betrayed their spouses, but seemed to expect understanding and acceptance for doing so. Their delusion was perhaps the cruelest part of all. They wanted their victims to validate their betrayal. The most painful part wasn't just the betrayal. It was watching Daniel and Emily try to dress up their selfishness as some kind of grand romance. They sat there, hands intertwined, speaking about their right to happiness, as if they were heroes in their own love story, not architects of destruction. How do you explain to your own child that following your heart doesn't justify breaking others? What they called love looked more like a hurricane, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. Sharon, who had stood by Daniel through every up and down, now sat alone in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house, trying to understand how the man she married could turn into a stranger. She'd given him everything, her trust, her love, her dreams, and he'd traded it all for stolen moments with his brother's wife. And Brian, my God, Brian, the double betrayal cut deeper than any wound could. His wife and his brother, the 2 people he trusted most in the world, had conspired behind his back, turning years of shared memories into questions. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual visit, he now wondered if they'd been laughing at him all along. The day he packed up his kids and left their family home, leaving behind the life he'd built so carefully, something in his eyes had changed. The light of trust had gone out. Daniel and Emily seemed to float above it all in their bubble of delusion, as if their happiness somehow justified the wreckage they'd created. They moved in together almost immediately, flaunting their relationship like a trophy won in some twisted game. Every picture they posted, every public display of affection was like rubbing salt in open wounds. My wife and I lay awake at night, turning over every moment of Daniel's childhood in our minds. Where had we gone wrong? What had we missed? How does a boy you raised to know right from wrong grow up to betray his own brother? We'd taught both our sons about honor, about loyalty, about family, though. Yet here we were, watching one son destroy another without a hint of remorse. The Sunday dinner stopped. The family photos came down from the walls, too painful to look at now. Our home, once filled with laughter and love, became eerily quiet. Brian rarely visits anymore. The pain is still too fresh. When he does come by, it's like seeing a ghost of the man he used to be. He's trying to rebuild his life, focusing on his kids and his work. But how do you recover from a betrayal that deep? Sharon threw herself into her work, trying to outrun the humiliation and heartbreak. She'd lost not just her husband, but her place in our family, a family she'd become such an integral part of. Sometimes she calls my wife, needing someone to talk to who understands the full scope of what was lost. Those conversations always end in tears. Meanwhile, Daniel and Emily continued their lives as if they'd won some kind of prize instead of destroying two families. They seemed genuinely surprised when people didn't celebrate their love story. It was as if they expected everyone to ignore the trail of broken hearts and shattered trust they'd left behind, all in the name of their supposed happiness. Time didn't heal these wounds, it just made them deeper. Brian retreated into a world of his own, building walls around his heart that even we, his parents, couldn't breach. Our attempts to reach him felt like throwing pebbles at a fortress. Sharon disappeared into her work, her silence speaking volumes about the depth of her pain. And there we were, stuck in the middle, loving both our sons, but horrified by what one had done to the other. The worst part was watching Daniel and Emily parade their love across social media like victory banners. Every smiling selfie, every living my best life post was like a knife twisting an already bleeding wounds. They painted themselves as star-crossed lovers who had overcome obstacles to be together, conveniently forgetting that those obstacles were their own spouses and families. Whenever we tried confronting Daniel about the pain he'd caused, he'd wave it away with practiced excuses. "Love conquers all," he'd say, as if love was supposed to leave this much destruction in its wake. "Everyone will understand eventually," he'd insist, while his brother couldn't even look at family photos anymore and his ex-wife cried herself to sleep. But life has a way of teaching the hardest lessons. 2 months into their epic romance, Emily proved that betrayal was just her nature. She met someone new, her next true love, and this time, Daniel was the one left shattered. But Emily didn't just break his heart. She broke him completely. She drained his bank accounts, took everything of value from their shared apartment, and vanished like a thief in the night, leaving behind only the mess she'd made of his life. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman he'd destroyed his family for had turned around and destroyed him. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't the romantic hero anymore. He was just another victim of Emily's ability to find her true love and whoever could offer her the most at the moment. That's when Daniel came home, tail between his legs, spinning a new story where he was the victim. Gone was the talk of destined love and unavoidable connections. Now it was all about how Emily had manipulated him, used him, tricked him into betraying everyone who truly loved him. He wanted everything back, his place in the family, his brother's trust, even Sharon's forgiveness. He acted as if saying sorry could somehow erase the months of deliberate choices he'd made. My wife and I found ourselves in the cruelest position parents can face. Here was our son, broken and desperate, needing us. The instinct to protect him, to help him rebuild his life was strong. But how could we comfort him without betraying Brian again? How could we help him without minimizing the pain he'd caused? Every tear Daniel cried reminded us of the ocean of tears he'd caused others to shed. He kept saying he'd learned his lesson, but had he really? Or was he just sorry he got hurt in the end? Brian was still putting his life back together, focusing on his kids and trying to trust again. The last thing he needed was his brother showing up, asking for forgiveness he hadn't earned, seeking absolution he didn't deserve. It's hard watching your children suffer, even when one of them caused the suffering. Daniel keeps talking about redemption like it's something he can simply claim, not earn. He doesn't see that every time he asks for forgiveness, he's reopening wounds that have barely started to heal. Sharon is finally beginning to smile again, finding her way back to herself. How can we ask her to relive this nightmare just because Daniel finally faced consequences? My wife's heart pulls her toward Daniel. It's a mother's instinct to help her child when they're hurting. But I keep thinking about Brian's kids, about how their whole world changed because of their uncle's choices. Some broken things can't be glued back together and expected to hold the same weight. I turned to an online parenting forum asking if I was wrong for wanting to keep my distance from Daniel, even though he's hit rock bottom. The responses flooded in, each one carrying wisdom from people who'd seen similar family tragedies play out. After 3 days of reading strangers' perspectives and countless sleepless nights, I knew I needed to talk to Brian first. The conversation we had broke my heart all over again. Sitting across from my eldest son at his small rental kitchen table, I saw a man still bleeding from invisible wounds. "Dad," he said, his coffee growing cold between his hands. I used to look at old family photos and see memories. Now all I see are questions. Was she already seeing him in this picture? Were they laughing at me during this vacation? His voice cracked as he spoke about the therapy sessions helping him piece himself back together, about learning to trust again, about trying to explain to his kids why Uncle Daniel doesn't come around anymore. The part that gutted me most was when he talked about being the big brother. "I always protected him, Dad," Brian said, tears finally breaking through. When kids picked on him in school, when he needed money for his first car, when he was struggling to find a job, I was there. And this is how he repaid that loyalty. He showed me his phone where he'd blocked both Daniel and Emily's numbers. Some betrayals you don't come back from. Meeting with Brian that day showed me a side of grief I'd never understood before. He sat there, a shadow of his former self, dark circles under his eyes telling stories of sleepless nights. When I offered to take the kids for a while, giving him space to breathe, something flashed across his face that looked like pure fear. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "my kids are the only thing keeping me sane right now." He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Their morning chaos, homework questions, bedtime stories, it's like an anchor keeping me from drifting away. Without them, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Watching my son cling to his role as a father, like a life raft in stormy seas, broke something in me. Here was my firstborn, always the strong one, now gathering his strength from his children's laughter, their simple needs, their unconditional love. Every morning routine, every school pickup, every Band-Aid applied to a scraped knee. These ordinary moments were now extraordinary lifelines pulling him back from the edge. Then came the news about Emily, and the irony was almost too much to bear. She'd reached out to Brian after her latest true love had fallen apart. Her message is a mixture of hollow apologies and more manipulative nonsense about destiny and special connections. It seems she was collecting soulmates like some people collect stamps, each one more meant to be than the last. "She still doesn't get it, Dad," Brian said, showing me the messages before deleting them. "She talks about her and Daniel being meant to be right after this other guy didn't work out. Then she has the nerve to say she misses the kids, like she didn't blow up their world for a fling that didn't even last." The exhaustion in his voice was palpable, but there was something else too, a quiet strength growing from the ashes of his old life. He'd blocked Emily everywhere, shut down every avenue she might use to worm her way back in. It wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about protecting his kids from the chaos she brought with her. After talking with Brian, the weight of this impossible situation settled even deeper into my bones. My son was rebuilding himself piece by piece, finding solace in therapy sessions, discovering new passions in hiking trails and blank canvases, even contemplating a fresh start in a new city. Each small step forward was hard-won, and I couldn't bear the thought of Daniel's presence sending him spiraling back into darkness. The drive home from Brian's place was the longest of my life. Every mile brought a new memory of my boys growing up together, baseball games, camping trips, shared secrets, and inside jokes. Now all those memories were tainted, like old photographs bleached by harsh sunlight. My wife met me at the door, hope in her eyes. She's always been our family's heart, believing in second chances and the power of a mother's love to heal all wounds. But as I shared Brian's story, I watched that hope fade. She sank into her favorite chair, the one where she used to rock both boys to sleep. And for the first time, I think she truly understood the depth of the chasm Daniel had created. "I keep thinking about when they were little," she whispered, tears falling silently. Daniel would always run to Brian when he was scared or hurt. "How did we get here?" Her hands twisted in her lap, a mother's helplessness made visible. She'd been trying to build bridges between our sons, not realizing that every attempt was like pressing on a bruise that hadn't healed. Together, we faced the hardest truth of parenting. Sometimes loving your child means letting them face the consequences of their actions. We couldn't shield Daniel from the storm he'd created, couldn't smooth things over with hugs and cookies like when he was small. His redemption, if it ever came, would have to be earned through actions, not words. The decision to step back felt like failure at first. Every parental instinct screamed to protect, to fix, to make everything better. But we had to acknowledge that by trying to help Daniel, we were hurting Brian all over again. Sometimes love means making the harder choice, even when it breaks your heart. Life has a way of bringing things full circle. 2 days after my talk with Brian, I opened our front door to find Daniel, but not the son I remembered. Gone was the charming smile, the easy confidence. Instead, there stood a broken man, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow, looking more like a stray dog than my son. The story spilled out between shaky breaths and avoided eye contact. Emily, his soulmate, had cleaned him out completely. Bank accounts drained, credit cards maxed, even his personal belongings sold off before she vanished with yet another true love. Karma had come calling, and she'd brought the bill for all his choices. Standing there in our doorway, watching him struggle to ask for help, I felt the weight of every parent's nightmare. Part of me wanted to shut the door, to protect our family from more pain. The other part remembered a little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, seeking safety from the storm. My wife's face told the whole story. Her maternal instincts were waging war with her disappointment. "He's still our son," she whispered, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. Even as she said it, we both knew nothing would ever be simple again. The sight of Daniel, once so full of life and promise, now reduced to begging for shelter from his own mistakes, was almost more than she could bear. We set our terms firmly. This wasn't just a place to crash. This was his last chance at redemption. He needed to face the wreckage he'd left behind, starting with Sharon. Sweet, loyal Sharon, who, according to her family, was still struggling to trust anyone after Daniel's betrayal, the woman who had loved our son completely, only to have that love thrown back in her face. "You'll stay in the guest room," I told him, my voice harder than I'd intended. "But this isn't a fresh start. This is your chance to face what you've done, to make real amends, not just say sorry and expect everything to go back to normal." Daniel nodded, shoulders slumped, mumbling promises about making things right, but I couldn't help wondering, was he truly sorry for what he'd done, or just sorry he'd gotten burned in the end? The glimmer of hope I saw in Daniel's eyes that first night turned out to be nothing more than fool's gold. Over the next 48 hours, our house became a front row seat to a performance I'd seen too many times before. There he was, sprawled across our living room couch, like a teenager on summer break. His eyes glazed over as he bounced between mindless TV shows and endless social media scrolling. What struck me most wasn't his laziness. It was his complete lack of emotional response to everything that had happened. Here was a man who had just lost his fiancée, his savings, and his dignity, yet he carried on as if he was on vacation. Emily, the woman he had claimed was his soulmate, had betrayed him in the worst possible way, but you wouldn't know it from his behavior. The devastating blow that should have shaken him to his core seemed to barely register. My wife and I exchanged worried glances as precious hours slipped away. No calls to Brian and Sharon, No attempts to right his wrongs, no sign of the remorse that had seemed so genuine when he first showed up at our doorstep. Each passing moment confirmed what we were trying desperately not to admit. We had made a terrible mistake in letting him stay. Our home wasn't becoming his sanctuary for healing, it was becoming his hideout. The breaking point came when I finally confronted him. The words poured out of me like a dam breaking, carrying years of accumulated frustration. "This isn't a free hotel, Daniel," I remember saying, my voice trembling with disappointment. My wife, who had always been Daniel's strongest defender, stood beside me, her earlier compassion replaced by a hardened resolve. Together, we delivered our verdict. He had 1 hour to pack his things and leave. The conditions for his return were simple but firm. Real apologies to Brian and Sharon, backed by concrete actions to make things right. We needed more than words this time. We needed proof of change. The shock on Daniel's face was almost comical, as if we'd broken an unspoken agreement that we would always be his safety net. But this time was different. This time, we couldn't be the cushion that softened his fall. As he walked out our door, we knew what would come next. Like clockwork, our phones began lighting up within hours, messages, calls, voicemails, all variations on the same theme. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." His words painted a beautiful picture of redemption and change, but we'd seen this masterpiece before. It was the same pattern playing out like a tired rerun. Daniel messing up, apologizing with Oscar-worthy conviction, then sliding right back into his old ways once the dust settled. But this time, the credits would roll differently. This time, we weren't picking up the phone. We stood firm against Daniel's flood of apologies. "Save your words," we told him. "Brian and Sharon are the ones who need to hear them." The time for enabling his carefree lifestyle had ended. Like parents watching their child finally face reality, we knew this tough love was necessary. His actions had created ripples that turned into waves, crashing through the lives of those around him. The real heroes of this story were quietly suffering across town. Brian and Sharon had become our priority now, their pain a constant reminder of why we couldn't back down this time. Every small gesture of support we offered felt inadequate against the magnitude of their hurt, but we kept trying, showing up day after day with whatever help we could provide. Then came the turning point. One evening, watching Brian juggle his work, his grief, and his children's needs, we saw the exhaustion etched deep in his face. The kids, innocent as they were, couldn't understand why their daddy seemed different, why his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. Something had to give. With hearts full of concern, we approached Brian with what we knew would be a difficult proposition. "Let us take the kids for a while," we offered, watching his face cloud over with uncertainty. "Just a week or two." Brian's immediate resistance didn't surprise us. Those children were his anchor in the storm, his reason to keep moving forward when everything else had fallen apart. But sometimes being a good parent means knowing when to accept help. We could see the internal battle playing out behind his tired eyes. The thought of being separated from his children, even temporarily, seemed to physically pain him. Yet beneath the resistance, a small spark of recognition flickered, perhaps acknowledging that he needed this break more than he was willing to admit. After what felt like hours of gentle persuasion, Brian finally conceded. His shoulders slumped in both relief and worry as he helped pack the kids' bags, sneaking extra hugs and kisses when he thought we weren't looking. We promised updates, video calls, and complete access whenever he needed it. This wasn't about separating a father from his children. It was about giving him space to breathe, to grieve, to begin the long process of healing. The universe, it seemed, had its own timing. Just as we were settling into our temporary arrangement with the kids, fate threw another curveball. Daniel, perhaps sensing the shift in the family dynamic, chose this moment to appear at Brian's doorstep. The stage was set for a confrontation we'd all been anticipating, though none of us could predict how this chapter would unfold. The moment Daniel appeared on Brian's doorstep, years of betrayal and hurt exploded into raw fury. The air crackled with tension as Brian lunged forward, his fists clenched, ready to unleash all his pent-up pain on his younger brother. I held my breath, certain I was about to witness our family shatter completely. But then something shifted, something none of us expected. Daniel didn't dodge. He didn't spin his usual web of excuses or flash that charming smile. that had gotten him out of trouble so many times before. Instead, he stood there, shoulders slumped, accepting every harsh word Brian hurled at him. "I deserve this," he said quietly, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "All of it." Those 4 simple words changed everything. Brian's rage seemed to hit an invisible wall, not disappearing but transforming into something different, something that left room for conversation. The brothers moved from the doorstep to the living room, where Daniel finally unveiled the aftermath of his affair with Emily. His voice trembled as he described how she had methodically drained his accounts and vanished, leaving him penniless and alone. It was poetic justice, perhaps, but Brian's expression showed no satisfaction at his brother's downfall. After a long silence, Brian suggested they continue their discussion at our house the next day. My wife and I could hardly believe our eyes when both our sons walked through our door together. The tension was still there, hanging heavy in the air, but something else was present too, a fragile thread of possibility. That's when Brian revealed his ace in the hole. Emily had been persistently trying to contact him, leaving messages dripping with false remorse and manipulation. Now, those unwanted messages had become an unexpected weapon. Brian pulled out his phone, his jaw set with determination. Emily answered on the first ring, her voice honey-sweet with hope, but Brian's response was pure ice. With Daniel sitting beside him, he laid out the ultimatum: return every penny she had stolen from Daniel within 48 hours or face theft charges. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. In that moment, the brothers, despite everything between them, presented a united front against the woman who had played them both. This scene in our living room felt surreal, like watching a complex chess game where the pieces had suddenly decided to work together. Brian, the betrayed brother, was now fighting for Daniel, the betrayer. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something equally powerful, family stepping up when it mattered most, despite the wounds that still ran deep. Emily's confident facade crumbled instantly. Her voice, usually dripping with sweetness, dissolved into panicked stutters. Brian didn't flinch. His words cut through her excuses like a steel blade through paper. 48 hours, he said, each syllable sharp and clear. That's all you get. After that, we go to the police. The threat wasn't empty. We could all hear the steel in his voice. The tables had turned so completely it was almost poetic. Emily, who had played puppet master with both brothers' lives, was now scrambling to maintain control, but Brian had found his strength again, standing firm as she pleaded for more time. In that moment, he wasn't just a betrayed husband or a wounded brother. He was a force to be reckoned with, refusing to dance to Emily's tune any longer. When the call ended, the silence in our living room felt electric. Brian and Daniel sat there, united by circumstance rather than choice, like 2 survivors of the same storm. The wall between them hadn't come down, but a small window had opened. They weren't ready to embrace as brothers again. The wounds were still too fresh, the trust too fragile. But they had found common ground in their shared battle against Emily's manipulation. Brian made no promises about forgiveness. His words were clear and measured. This doesn't fix what happened, but right now, we deal with her. Daniel nodded, understanding that this temporary alliance didn't erase his betrayal. It was a business arrangement more than a brotherly reconciliation, but it was a start. Life continued in careful patterns over the next 2 days. Daniel kept his distance, working to untangle his financial mess. My wife and I threw ourselves into caring for the grandkids, creating a bubble of normalcy in the midst of chaos. We played board games, baked cookies, and tried to shield them from the storm that was reshaping their family. Then came the breakthrough we'd been hoping for. Emily, cornered by Brian's ultimatum, transferred most of Daniel's money back. The amount wasn't complete, but it was substantial enough to bring relief to everyone's faces. When Daniel saw the bank notification, tears spilled down his cheeks. He turned to Brian, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I know I don't deserve your help, but I promise I'll make this right somehow." This wasn't a fairy tale ending. The road to true reconciliation would be much longer and harder. But watching Brian reclaim his power, seeing him protect his brother despite everything, gave us all a glimmer of hope. Sometimes healing starts in the strangest ways, even in the midst of betrayal and pain. Sometimes healing begins not with forgiveness, but with validation. For Brian, getting Emily to return Daniel's money wasn't about the money at all. It was proof that he wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't the villain in this story. He had walked through fire with his head held high, choosing integrity when others had chosen betrayal. That knowledge became his first solid stepping stone toward healing. The path ahead still stretched long and uncertain, but now Brian could focus on what truly mattered: his children. Their laughter had become his compass, their love his anchor in the storm. When they returned home from staying with us, the house felt different somehow. Not healed, not yet, but ready for new memories to be made. "You're not alone in this," we reminded him, watching him tuck the kids into bed that first night back. "We're here whenever you need us." The gratitude in his eyes said more than words could. We knew there would still be hard days ahead, moments when the weight of Emily's betrayal would feel too heavy to bear, times when seeing Daniel would reopen barely healed wounds. But something had shifted. The air felt lighter, as if the universe itself was taking a deep breath. Emily's shadow still lingered at the edges of our lives, a reminder of what had been lost, but it no longer dominated every conversation, every thought. Brian was reclaiming his story, one small victory at a time. As we drove home that evening, leaving Brian and the kids to settle back into their routine, my wife squeezed my hand. No words were needed. We both understood that while this chapter was ending, the story was far from over. But that was okay. Our family had bent, but not broken, weathered the storm, but not drowned, and sometimes in the midst of life's greatest challenges, that's enough of a miracle to hold on to. The future would unfold in its own time, at its own pace. For now, we would continue to be the steady presence Brian needed, the safe harbor in his storm. Because that's what family does. We stand together, we heal together, we hope together. One day at a time, one small step after another, until the path ahead becomes clear again. As our story comes to an end, Daniel's betrayal reminds us that our choices can shatter more than just hearts. They can tear entire families apart. But sometimes, even in our darkest moments, family proves stronger than we imagine. One phone call from Brian didn't just get Daniel's money back. It showed that blood runs deeper than betrayal. The lesson here isn't just about karma catching up with Emily or about Daniel facing the consequences of his actions. It's about Brian's strength in helping the same brother who betrayed him, even while his own wounds were still fresh. He chose to be better, not bitter. Today, Brian continues rebuilding his life, focusing on his children and healing day by day. Daniel learned the hardest way possible that true love isn't built on destroying others' happiness. And Emily? Well, she lost everything she tried to steal: money, love, and family. This story proves that life has a way of coming full circle. Sometimes the person you hurt the most becomes your unexpected savior. And sometimes justice comes through a single phone call. If this story touched you or made you think differently about family and forgiveness, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear that even after the deepest betrayal, hope can still find its way through. Remember, karma might take the scenic route, but it always arrives right on time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.